Okay, well, welcome everybody to this Independent Scientific Advocacy Group webinar. So as usual, we're going to have a situation update on the state of the pandemic in Ireland, but we're also going to have a special topic today. We're talking about the case for quarantine and the considerations there. So we have a few members of the team who'll be speaking and a guest speaker as well, and we'll have time for questions and answers as well. So we'll reserve time for that at the end. And if you look in Zoom, you'll see there's a question and answer function there that you can use. So our group are a group of independent people of all kinds, scientists, medics, and anybody who's interested in it. We've come together because we strongly believe that we can get out of this situation, that there's a way that we can start living again, and we don't have to wait for the vaccine, which will take a longer time. But there's steps we need to take to achieve that, and quarantining is one of those important steps. So that's why we're talking about that today. So I'm going to hand over first to Paul Dempsey, who's a mathematical scientist, who's going to present some of the data and the projections for the near future. Thank you, Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let's bring up the screens. So just kind of go through quickly the numbers as they're happening right now. So in the Republic, we kind of see in the recent days, everyone has seen in the daily news that the overall case numbers are going down. Obviously very, very welcome. One of the kind of points of concern we would have is, if you look where the arrow is here, is that the age groups, the 65 pluses, the 30 and the 15 to 34s and 35 to 64s are all converging, getting close to the same values. This is not something we really want to see, because it means that a larger portion of the older group are responsible for the newer cases so far. This seems to be, in the newest HSBC values, driven by the oldest of this group, the 85 plus. So we still are in for a little while of concern until we can get these numbers down very fast. Looking at the children, the blue line just under there to the side, it looks better than everybody else, but it's still much worse than it would have been for any of the other age groups at any other point since the last peak. Just to comment on these type of charts when we're looking at them, on this side here, it's a logarithmic scale, which means instead of going up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we tend to go up in multiples, because that's what viruses do. So it goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, up like that. And that allows us to quickly look at patterns without being exposed to these really sharp spikes that you would have seen in some other graphs. Okay, for Northern Ireland, we're seeing a similar picture. Again, a similar situation. One thing we are noticing here is normally, and they have slightly different age groups, but normally when the cases start to go down in most of the independent living groups, the groups that require some care tend to have this flatlining or a slower reduction in cases. But with the vaccination program hitting a good portion of the over 80s in Northern Ireland, we're seeing for the first time that this age group are starting to decrease at a rate comparable or even possibly better than the rest of the age group. So that's some good news as far as vaccination goes for Northern Ireland. Again, that will help with the deaths in some while, but it won't help particularly much with ICU or hospital cases. So it's really important to get the cases down in all the age groups for that purpose. Why, despite all these numbers looking like they're going down, why are we somewhat concerned as we look to the future? Well, one of the issues is these new variants that are coming in that are a bit more transmissible. So if we look overall, the positive test lab results, they've been going down very consistently since the start of the new year. But one thing it looks like, based on what we know so far, is that the B117 may not be going down fast enough, and we may be left with a steady state that's way too high if this becomes dominant. Now, the results from last week haven't been issued yet, so we won't know exactly what portion of the cases are from this, but this is kind of important to the best models we have to date. Now, is there anything else we can do? Well, the CSO last week put out the data on mobility. One thing to notice is this is how good we did back in April last year. So we really stayed within 10 kilometers of our home, and whichever location we were. Of course, 10 kilometers in Dublin is different than 10 kilometers in Monaghan, and in fairness, how many people you'll meet. So we really do need to get back to these April values to have an impact on that B117. As we can see here, during December, we were pretty much on line with where we were in January last year, which was before there was even any news of a pandemic hitting Europe. Now, on today's topic, we're most concerned with quarantining and trying to stop imported cases. These are the cases that keep coming in at small trickles, but build up very quickly as they grow in the community to levels that require lockdowns after a certain amount of time. So in this sample here, we're just talking about the situation where we have 2 imported cases a day, which is consistent with what you might expect at the moment in an optimistic scenario. Also, just the things that would happen over summer will be roughly around this. So for example, in July at one stage, there was around 36 in 1 week. So we're really underestimating here for the case of just demonstrating how bad having imported cases are, despite how small they are individually. So they build up quite quickly. You see both the green and red lines, depending on what they are. The green line, we decided to put in a quarantining situation where we don't let things get past the airports or their seaports. And we put in a strict lockdown like we had back in April, and the cases are able to drop really quickly. And this will be pretty much independent of which variant it is. What we're left with now is this kind of quasi situation where we still have a lot of activity on the roads, a lot of general activity, and we've no quarantines. So no matter how good we get, without having a quarantine in place, we can never get better than a certain fixed value. And once we reopen at this value, it just starts all over again. And again, if we try and act normally, we're back within a month of requiring another lockdown. And it's just this cycle that we keep hearing of. Yes, we'll have a lockdown, and over and over and over again. Even if we get the vaccines to the over 70s in time, we still have the issues we'll have with ICU overruns and hospital overruns. Now, if we just have a totally strict lockdown on its own, it's fine. The quarantine doesn't make much of a difference initially, but when it gets down to lower numbers, when we're trying to get under 100 a day, it starts to kick in, and it prevents us from getting to a case where we can actually really control it and afford to reopen the society again. So why don't we just test? Well, one of the problems with testing is it just doesn't work on its own. It needs quarantine. The tests simply aren't accurate. They won't enough. There's an incubation period where you just can't detect if you have the virus or not. So when the CDC did some analysis a few months ago, they pretty much said that you really do need the 14 days. There are possibilities where you can make some slight exceptions for some people at maybe 10 days, but it can't be a general rule. You'll get too many imports cases, and it's just too risky. That's why and this is with all the other possible conditions. You can have no symptoms, a negative test before arrival, and then we look at the difference between how long the different quarantine periods are required. How could this actually work in Ireland in practice? Well, if we looked at our arrivals from the CSO, we'll see during April, we get a good estimate of what is actually essential traffic, and it's very, very small. Even if you look at April and May, they're tiny numbers. They're about 4,000-ish a week, maybe 5,000. And the answer of how do we have enough hotel space to fix them? It will obviously require some planning to make sure we get the right accommodation, but we have a large portion of rooms and beds that will be able to house people with the appropriate protocols for the 2 weeks that we require. Okay, that's my time for today, and I'll pass you over to Aoife now.
Thank you, Paul. That's very useful, and it's very interesting. I think it's very informative for people to see the impacts of quarantine, and also to see that, you know, testing is a very useful tool, but it's not enough on its own. And I think we want these things to be, we want to solve this problem, and we need to use all of the tools at our disposal. So I'm going to hand over now to Philipp Hoevel, who's a mathematician from UCC, who's going to talk to us a bit more about some of the models and projections, and then we're going to move on to talking more specifically about quarantine after that. Philipp, I can't hear you at the moment.
All right, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect, wonderful. Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks also for Paul, because he mentioned a lot of points that will also show up during my few minutes of presentation here. So I'm based at University College Cork in the School of Mathematical Sciences. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a few of the results of a model study of simulations, which have the beauty that we can study different scenarios. So the model itself consists of around 4,000, a little bit more than 4,000 areas in all of Ireland. This includes the Republic as well as Northern Ireland. You can think of one area as the electoral divisions, or in Northern Ireland as the super output areas. So in every island, in every area, we have a model which consists of 5 compartments: susceptible, so this is the healthy, the infected. This is what I will show here for the different aggregated for the different counties. And then there's also isolated, which means quarantined, which will be also then the topic for later presentations today. And then of course we have the removed or the recovered, those people that are immune, and then ultimately also people in the death compartment, people that unfortunately have died. So the point that I want to make in this slide and in the next couple of slides is to raise the importance of compliance here. So what I show you here is the time series of the infected, starting from the first peak, so around March and April. And I just want to focus here for the moment on the case of Dublin. You see it peaked highest. And then those shaded areas, this is the roadmap scenario, which really got the numbers down. But when we took the foot from the brakes, then the numbers came up again. So these additional peaks, these additional spikes in this dashed line, this was due to implementing a threshold in any of the counties where we said just 1,400 infected cases were tolerable. And this was the number that we got from the time when Dublin moved from level 2 to level 3 restrictions back in October. And if you have 100% compliance on that, so this lead to a significant travel reductions, which meant we went through the phases of the roadmap again. So you see that the numbers go down, but once you stop, once you terminate those restrictions, you lift them, then numbers go up again, similar to what Paul alluded to a little bit earlier. So you can see that this happens not only for Dublin, but also for other counties. And down in red, you can see really the whole time series aggregated for any of the counties in Ireland. So that's for 100% compliance. Everybody behaved nicely. They stick to the 2-kilometer radius to 5-kilometer or 20-kilometer radius. But just imagine what happens with just a little bit of non-compliance in here. So there's just 1% non-compliance, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you remember the numbers that Paul showed you from the time that was in April, the people coming in, the influx of the international travels compared to the travel in normal times, this was around 1% that was still coming in. Then you can see that yes, the measures they have some effect in the sense that the blue curve in Dublin went down again, but then you see this unexpected turnaround. Although we have a threshold of 1,400, still the restriction measures do not have a significant impact because they are still influx from other parts of the island. So ultimately, the peak, so the second peak of Dublin here, is higher even than the first peak was, although there were county-based travel restrictions in place. You can see others following suit. So just imagine what happens if you go to something like 80% compliance, which would be the number that was backed up by a telephone survey, where people people reported that they were compliant to the travel restrictions to up to 80%. You can see that the numbers really go up and even higher than the first peak, and that's despite the travel restrictions being implemented. And also compare this, put all of those curves for Dublin in one slide, but the picture just remains consistent. So that it's really important to have a high level of compliance, nearly 100%. Otherwise, those measures will not be too effective. Or if you put it on one page, as take-home messages here for my couple of slides, is independent of how you define the borders, being it county borders, being it borders within in other areas, or whether being it borders between countries, the virus doesn't stop at borders, so it stops with every single one of us. So every measure, in some sense, counts. And today we talk about quarantine, but there was last week there was also a session about vaccination in particular. But any of the others that are listed here, and this list is by no means exclusive, they will help. And let me just close by making this analogy about flying sparks, why this little 1% non-compliant already had such a negative impact. So if you think of a forest fire that has been just put out, and there's still this little bit fire left, and sparks will be flying around, It's just a little tiny spark, but it could cause a resurgence of the overall forest fire. So in some sense, every contact could be seen as a flying spark that could lead to the next hotspot. So this is my 2 cents that I wanted to share, and I stop sharing here and then hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, so that is, I think there's a lot of information there, a lot to take in for people, but I think you know, the main point that you're making, that it's so important that we get compliance for these measures if we want to be able to control this virus. And I think, again, like you say, we need to use every possible tool at our disposal. So I'm now going to hand over to Gabriel Scally, who I think is well known to many people in Ireland. Very, very well-known, well-regarded public health doctor working in the UK, and is a member of ISAG in the UK, which is a bit like us, but or at least we try to be like you. But we're very grateful that Gabriel can be here today, and he's going to talk about the international case for quarantine. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and talking to you on this really important issue. I think to put it in context, we have a general excitement now about vaccination and what vaccination is going to do for us and do for the world. But we do know that that's going to be a long process in rolling that vaccination program out, and it's going to vary substantially from country to country. And there is great concern, particularly in lesser developed countries, about availability of vaccines and how long it will take them to get their population, and particularly those most at risk, vaccinated. But we can't put all our eggs in the basket of vaccination. In the meantime, and it could be quite a long time, certainly for the rest of this year, we will need to be on guard to a substantial extent about the virus. We need to do 3 things in terms of the virus: get it down, keep it down, and keep it out. And those lessons, I think, apply to all countries, no matter what position they're in at the moment. When we look around the world at the countries that have done really well, a high proportion of those countries that have avoided death and disease from COVID-19 are islands, and they've taken advantage of their island status. And we should be, I think, looking at their success, particularly at this point, and seeing what we have to learn from them. The whole principle of quarantine is a very old one. It goes back centuries. And it is about making sure that cases of a deadly disease cannot be brought into your country. And it has operated very successfully as a means of control, and still does. And there are still international restrictions on movement of people. For example, you have to produce vaccination certificates in some countries for yellow fever, in some places for polio, as we try to eradicate polio. So border controls and restrictions on public health grounds are well known to us. But in the case, certainly of these 2 islands, Britain and Ireland, they have not been operating at all effectively. In fact, they've hardly been operating at all. And what we need now, in the place that we're in, is to try and stop the further importation of cases. Why do we need to do that? We need to do that because we want to have take full advantage of vaccination and get the virus really, really down. And we don't want the sort of importations. And Paul has explained to you the effect that importations of cases can have. We also are most concerned, I think, across the world at the moment about the new variants of COVID-19 that are appearing. One of the reasons they're appearing is because there are so many cases, and the more cases there are, the more infections there are, the more chance there is of those mutations taking place and new variants appearing. And we suspect some of those variants that we know about now are much more infectious and are a great concern. But there may well be other variants coming along, including some that will, as the vaccine develops and as the vaccine operates in an era of vaccination, may enable the virus to dodge some of the effects of the vaccine and infect people that otherwise would have been protected by it. So for all of these reasons, it is a good time to think again about how we're going to handle the virus. And my position and my argument is that we should be looking at strict border controls in terms of, on public health grounds, in terms of the importation of the virus. And travelers coming can bring the virus. And you'll have seen the data that Paul showed, I think, about the level of time that is needed to be sure that someone isn't spreading it. What we've had up till now has been very much a voluntary system. I know people have been told to self-isolate for 14 days or 10 days if you happen to be in the UK. And that is indeed a voluntary system. There is no real enforcement of that or checks on that, and it hasn't proven effective. And there have been some very well documented instances of the virus being transmitted by travelers. And travelers are not normal people because they have traveled and they have mixed in getting to their airport, in perhaps changing airplanes somewhere around the world, in departure lounges, on the airplane itself, and on the transport when they arrive. And all of those are opportunities for viral spread on an international, a grand scale. And that's what we seek to avoid. So I think a proposal for improving our control on the virus coming into these islands is very, very appropriate. And that would consist of prior notification of all people who are going to travel by through our airports or ferry ports, the taking of a test perhaps 3 days before departure or arrival to make sure that they're negative before they travel. But of course, we can't be sure of that because they may pick up the virus in those days between having the test and traveling. Or they may be infected, but not at a sufficient level to produce a positive with the test. And then instead of a self-isolation process where that is required, and we know there have been difficulties with movement of travelers between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the exemptions from requirements to self-isolate, depending on how they've moved, all of that should be replaced with a system of managed isolation, where everyone who comes in through ports and airports is required to self-isolate for 14 days, perhaps with tests along the way, so that we can be absolutely sure that we're not importing new cases of the virus, and particularly that we're not importing cases of new variants of the virus, which could be much more harmful. Those costs would have to be met by the travelers, and they would have to be counted into their entire cost of traveling. In terms of its economic effect, it would have an effect, of course. One of the positive effects would be that there are plenty of empty hotel rooms that could be used and facilities that could be used to house those people for that quarantine period. But the advantage of getting the virus down, keeping it down, and keeping it out means a far quicker return to normality. And one only has to look across the world to heavily populated, densely populated, high population islands like Taiwan or Japan, or to Australia, a whole continent which has adopted this approach, and New Zealand, all of which have operated successfully. It can be done and it should be done. And it's the best way to ensure that over the rest of this year, 2021, that we avoid having any more big peaks in terms of cases and deaths. And we shouldn't, of course, forget long COVID as well, the disability that is caused by the spread of the virus. So now is not a time for taking our foot off the pedal because of vaccination coming along. Now is the time to use all of the tools we have in our toolbox to keep this virus down and make sure it doesn't come in through our ports and airports. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Gabriel. Really appreciate that contribution. And I think it is important that everybody understands that the vaccine isn't a sure thing in one sense. You know, we can inadvertently sabotage the whole vaccination program by allowing this virus to keep evolving and potentially evolve a vaccine-resistant strain. And I would hope to think that, you know, Europe didn't have much experience with this type of pandemic before last year. You'd hope to think that if a new pandemic arose now, they would react quickly, and the first thing they would do in that circumstance would be close the borders. And in some respects, we ought to be thinking about these new variants, which are some of them more transmissible, and some of them were concerned about them being more deadly and potentially even vaccine resistant. We might even conceptualize those like a whole new pandemic at our shores, and we should be doing everything we can to keep those out. So I think that's a very important point for people to understand. We do not want to be back at square one. Thank you, Gabriel, for that. So now I'm going to move to Kevin Cunningham, who runs a website called Ireland Thinks, which does a lot of opinion polling. And he has been collecting opinions on quarantine among Irish people. So I think he can present some of his information. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us.
Thanks, Aoife. So I'm just going to present some of the data on the poll I did on quarantine, but also just a background as to why this sort of thing is relevant, I guess, as a political scientist as well, which is kind of my normal day job, I guess. Okay, so just okay, so is public opinion polling important? Within the political science literature, at least, there seems to be very broad evidence that public opinion polling public opinion can influence public policy. It's a fairly agreed understanding. One important feature to consider, certainly in the context of this particular debate, is that relationship is frequently moderated by a number of other factors. One is the salience of the issue itself. And obviously in relation to COVID-19, it's a highly salient issue. You know, sometimes when issues are relatively non-salient, it's less likely that you're going to have that relationship between public opinion and the congruence between public opinion and policy. Also, economic elites and interest groups. Interest groups can obviously advance and exacerbate the relationship between public opinion and policy, or they can kind of try to argue against those issues. Another part is political parties in government. So if the supporters of the political parties in government tend to oppose those particular policies that a majority support, then it's likely that the government themselves will oppose those policies. So it's important then to consider in these polls the extent to which supporters of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil support these particular things. And then the last thing, which I think is particularly relevant in the context of quarantine and a lot of other issues which have come up in the context of the pandemic, is inter-party competition. That is the extent to which the opposition exacerbate and emphasize that particular issue. Now, relatively recently, in the last couple of days, obviously, political parties of the opposition have taken up these positions, which I think is perhaps a positive thing in terms of the likelihood that there will be more congruence between public opinion and public policy on these issues. So that's just an important consideration. So another thing worth adding, mainly because it's not necessarily a political science audience, is that an ongoing question frequently you hear is, can we trust public opinion polls? Well, it's just worth adding in this sort of thing is that Will Jennings and Chris Valazian had a paper in 2018 in Nature where they went through tens of thousands of public opinion polls and election results and found that there hadn't really been any decline in the relative accuracy of public opinion polling. That the average error, the mean absolute error, was around 2%. Now, it's worth recognizing that this 2% is significantly larger effectively than the often quoted sort of 95% confidence interval. When you typically hear about a public opinion poll of a sample size of 1,000, you'll only really hear the reported sampling error, which is around 3%. But in fact, there's other sources of error in terms of the response rate, in terms of how the questions were asked, and also in terms of that kind of gap between when the poll was conducted and when, you know, it's easy to see what's actually happened or when voters have turned out. Using that data, it might be of some interest because, you know, often those errors are in the context of very marginal elections like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, which, you know, those things were actually relatively quite marginal. But broadly speaking, the equivalent of the 95% confidence interval will be actually around plus or minus 7.5% for public opinion polls, or if there were 90%, it would be plus or minus 5.5%, because the distribution of errors are slightly more like a Laplace or a Gumbel distribution. But anyway, the point is that broadly speaking, public opinion polls are relatively accurate within reason. one of the main things that's happening now is that there's a lot of differences between public opinion polls in how they're operated. Because of very low response rates in relation to telephone polling and face-to-face polling, a lot of people who would have been skeptical, like myself, of the idea of using online methods have kind of moved towards those methods, because there's a lot of things that you can manage in terms of trying to make sure to preempt an effective panel so that it's actually representative. Okay, so just in relation to the polling company I've set up, broadly speaking, just by way of background, this is emerged out of kind of my own disaffection with the polling industry in terms of its desire to kind of focus on accuracy relative to its clients. I was focused on politics, obviously, so I wanted to have slightly more reliable data purely from a research perspective, really. The method that I employ within Ireland Thinks is the same as the YouGov method, who I work with quite a lot, and which Pew and the AAPO are regarded as the most accurate. It uses a thing called propensity score matching and some attitudinal weighting to ensure that the selection of respondents are actually relatively reflect a nationally representative population. So in terms of, because this seems to be a thing that nowadays you need to explain to explain how these things work. It's an invite-only panel collected via random digit dialing and some targeted ads to identify people that haven't taken part in random digit dialing. It's around 40,000 people, but of those 40,000, only around 10% are actually asked to take part. The people that are asked to take part are identified because they're matched to an exit poll, census and census microdata based on age, gender, vote, and political interest and that sort of stuff. They're invited via an SMS message, each with the unique URL. Some people try to answer it twice, some people try to give it to their friends, but I'm able to identify all those additional things and exclude them. And then within an hour and a half, you get 1,247 respondents, as I did at the weekend. It's then weighted in kind of normal kind of polling ways. So in terms of the difference between the Ireland Thinks polls and the other public opinion polls, which this chart below from Stefan Mueller and Tom Norris from the UCD did, this is just the house effects of the different public opinion polls along the three largest parties, which is kind of the only question really which the polls kind of ask quite a lot about. And you can see the Ireland Thinks line is kind of the second one, which is basically has no house effect for Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. So just an idea that even though it's a relatively new and unfamiliar name, broadly speaking, the results are pretty much the same as, I'd say, Red C and MRBI at least, perhaps slightly different to the behaviours and attitudes polls. Okay, so onto the kind of dessert section, basically. So is there support for this quarantine issue? The question that was asked was, should those that arrive from abroad be required to quarantine in a hotel? And in this particular question, 90% responded yes, 7% responded no, and 2% responded don't know. I give a lot of the demographics and sort of attitudinal variables there, but broadly speaking, there isn't really much of a signal. This has quite large support across all demographics and all age groups, and even across political parties. The only weakness maybe among sort of Inc2 supporters, but again, the sample size for the number of people that I have who are supported Aim2 will be relatively low. So broadly speaking, there isn't really much in terms of who is the 7%, and broadly speaking, it isn't necessarily that informative to explore where the variance is, because it is 90% in favor of this particular initiative. Obviously, it has broad support across all the political parties, and so it stands to reason why, you know, now some political parties are emphasizing the issue, because obviously they know they're not going to lose any support from it either. The next one. So it's worth acknowledging that one of the fundamental blocks in this perhaps isn't the popularity, but the politicization of this as an issue. So this question was also asked in November, for which there was 76% in favor of hotel quarantines. So it's an issue for which there's always been support, but opinion, broadly speaking, has actually changed quite significantly since November. If you take the first question there in relation to opening indoor dining, there was actually a broad support for opening indoor dining. That poll was conducted in late November, just as those measures were being announced. And there was very large support for that, which obviously has reversed significantly since. That is one of the biggest changes. In many other areas, public opinion hasn't really changed that much in relation to whether people thought celebrating a traditional family Christmas was worth the additional period of lockdown. There was actually a majority believing that it wasn't useful to have the traditional family Christmas, and that has increased now significantly. But that was never really politicized, because I don't think there was many who were willing to kind of take up that particular issue. In relation to the last line there, if you see, are you confident in the current government's ability to tackle the pandemic? You'll see that that's actually relatively quite stable relative to the changes, at least in relation to reopening indoor dining. And part of this is a function of there being quite distinctive blocks within public opinion in Ireland on the issue of coronavirus that I've discussed quite previously, but I'm going to give you a little sample of it here again. So one thing I did previously in the November poll was I conducted a cluster analysis. Now, a cluster analysis is just a way of identifying similarities between how people are responding to different questions in an opinion poll. So, you know, you have some people who will tend to respond in similar ways. The cluster analysis itself was done using k-means clustering and vary max rotation for those that are interested. But it produced 4 very clear and distinct groups. And this was back in November, so obviously now there'll be kind of some movement between then and now. But I think this is interesting because it informs, you know, how normally in a political campaign, I guess, you would try to identify and target a particular group to kind of win over to your side. So the first group I kind of just labeled the COVID zeros, but they were the people who were more likely to be in favor of a relaxation of. They thought the relaxation of restrictions went too far. I think many will be on here. Indoor dining shouldn't have been allowed, that Christmas wasn't worth another lockdown, that Christmas should close before Christmas, and that sort of stuff. They were more likely to be female and, like almost all the groups, very likely to take the vaccine. The second group is perhaps most interesting because it doesn't necessarily feature in public debates, but it is certainly listening to the public debates. So the second group is the kind of compliant government supporters. These are people who tend to be confident in the government's handling of the pandemic, believing that the indoor dining was correct, and then when things changed, believing that indoor dining was incorrect. So generally a kind of a go with the flow group that tends to be slightly older and maybe cognizant of its own limited knowledge of the pandemic and following expert advice as it comes down from the government and NEFIT, broadly speaking. They rate the CMO very highly. The third group is that which is tired of COVID, people who report a significant decline in their mental health, generally really wanted indoor dining and lots of things, wanted to make sure that schools were kept open. But when it came to issues like quarantine and travel to Northern Ireland, issues that perhaps didn't necessarily affect them directly, they had broad support for those issues as well. So broadly speaking, the issue of quarantine and travel to Northern Ireland and fines, in fact, is another one. Those first 3 groups are generally quite supportive of. And then there's really a very small group, which is opposed to taking a vaccine and opposed to all restrictions, which is around 9% or even less, perhaps in this latest poll. They're mainly younger, mainly male, and living in rented accommodation usually. Just to show you some of the charts on that, just to emphasize how this government group believed that all the relaxation restrictions, and this poll was conducted back in November, was right. That kind of zero group, broadly speaking, thought that the relaxation went too far. The tired group was kind of a little bit more balanced between right and didn't go far enough. As I said, it was only really the zero group that was opposed to indoor dining. The other 3 groups, broadly speaking, were in favor of that reopening. As I said, these skeptic and tired groups are more concerned with the mental health. These 3 first groups that kind of said that 90+% were all likely to take the vaccine. In that poll, in fact, we had 70% likely to take the vaccine, which has gone up to 86%. I think Red C had pretty much an identical figure on the vaccine back then. And so the timing of this sort of stuff of the polls is actually quite relevant as well. In relation to friends and family, I think one of the perhaps more tragic features of this was this government compliant group was broadly felt that its friends and family were going to abide by restrictions, whereas the kind of skeptic groups and the other groups were more reluctant to believe that. And perhaps there was the interaction between those different groups that has kind of maybe some sense of some naivety, maybe on behalf of the government compliant group. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but maybe that's some reflection of what might have happened. And then other people, obviously, maybe to some extent, not necessarily adhering to the restrictions. And it was only really that government compliant group who's very strongly in support of the government handling the pandemic. So this is why I think that kind of that middle group is the one that's kind of the persuadable one, and the one that requires not just the opposition, but actually the government to change its mind. Perhaps the way to influence the government to change its mind on this is to kind of ensure that there's political pressure from, as I said, inter-party competition. In relation to the CMO, both the Zero group and the government compliant group were broadly supportive, and the other groups less so. Again, as I said, that kind of Christmas and lockdown, schools, I mentioned these sorts of issues. And in relation to quarantine, again, this is November, but you're seeing broad support even across that tired group for this particular issue. So even people who broadly wanted indoor dining to be reopened still thought that the quarantine issue was something that they would support. And indeed, as I said, the travel to Northern Ireland. In terms of whom they are, as I said, the Zero group is more likely to be female, the skeptic group more likely to be male, skeptic group more likely to rent, not really much in terms of educational attainment, slightly more likely among the government group to attend church more regularly in terms of that 35% there. And then in terms of, obviously, the government compliant group is one which supports Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil more likely, and the Zero group is a bit more balanced, but the tired and skeptic groups are much more likely to vote Sinn Féin. In terms of getting one's message out to particular news sources, the key news sources, I think, in terms of convincing that key kind of median voter, if it was a median voter, which is the government compliant group, is really focusing on those main news sources, which are RTÉ, the Irish Independent, and the Irish Times. This is a question just of where do they get their news from. The skeptic group is obviously off on other sorts of media channels and not paying much attention to the media more generally. Okay, so just some conclusions. So polls can influence public opinion. It requires engagement from interest groups, obviously like this one, and political parties as well to exert pressure on the government. Quarantine is popular broadly across almost all groups, but perhaps has lacked salience, as I said, within that inter-party competition. And in terms of the median voter on any of these kinds of COVID issues, that kind of that influential part of the electorate, I think, is more likely to be that kind of older Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael supporting group, and which perhaps holds the kind of balance between those that want more restrictions and those that want less, I guess. And
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so could you just stop screen sharing? Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, yes. So I think it's very interesting to see that there is broad popular support for quarantine, because I think that message hopefully will be received by the people who make the decisions around here. So I'm just going to ask finally Anthony Staines to wrap up for us, and then we're going to move to questions from any of the attendees. I see there have been questions have already been typed into the Q&A, and some of them have been answered by members of the panel, which is great. We can recap those for the benefit of everybody if you like, but if you have any other questions, please do enter them there, or if you prefer to speak, we can arrange to let you use your microphone if that's what you prefer. But now over to Anthony, who's going to give a summary. Thank you, Anthony.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I think the key message from all of this is things are difficult, but there are ways out. You can feel a bit overwhelmed listening to numbers rising intensive care beds rising, deaths rising, all these new strains of the virus emerging all over the world, which may behave differently to the strains we have here now. But the response to all of these is pretty much the same. It is the intensive public health measures we're talking about. Lockdown to bring the numbers down, case identification, contact tracing, contact tracking, isolation of cases, isolation of close contacts, quarantine at the airports, hand washing, wearing masks, all the things that we're talking about will control pretty much any virus we're likely to encounter. So we can address this if we want to. Each country has to decide for itself what it wants to do. But one thing I would say very clearly is I have a sense across Europe that many countries are facing the same challenges that we're facing, and many countries are moving towards the same conclusion, that we need to bring this virus sharply under control, but they're looking for somebody to go first. I think if we don't go first, Germany probably will. I have a strong sense that there's a lot of activity at federal level and at local level in Germany. So we have ways out of this. We have routes out of this. If we don't take those routes, the consequence of that on our head. But there is a lot of hope out there for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I think, yeah, that's a very important point to remember, you know, that it can be easy sometimes to feel despair in the face of all of this, because it is a very depressing situation, but there are things we can do, and that's what we're trying to do, and we're hoping that the right people are listening as well. So we have some questions in the Q&A box. If anybody wants to ask any more questions, they can raise their hand, but for the benefit of everybody, I'm going to repeat some of the ones that have already been answered by text, but we can discuss them a little bit. So one person asks about trade-offs. There's trade-offs with any policy, and what's the downside of any quarantine in terms of any sectors that might be affected, for example, export sectors like agriculture and things like that. So Gabriel, I think you were typing an answer to that one. Do you want to just say, and maybe Jerry then as well?
Yes, I think a lot of the concern has been about, well, would goods move? Would exports move? Would business still be able to happen? And I think the answer to that is yes, air freight and road freight has moved by plane and ferry without, as far as I'm aware, any significant outbreaks resulting from transference of the virus. And I think we know enough about the regulation of that to be able for it to operate quite successfully in a quarantine arrangement. The issue is about the movement of people. It's people that are the carriers for the virus, and that is what will be managed rather than unmanaged. And that does pose issues for some people. For example, one of the UK's exemptions is for people who travel on a regular basis, and by that they mean at least once a week on average. In and out from between two countries. And that will clearly be extraordinarily, it'd be impossible to do that. So there will be people who will be interfered with in terms of their normal movements. But that is no greater a change than so many people have had to make over the months. So many all over the country, keeping themselves at home, never getting to work, yet alone getting to another country to work. In essence, it's nothing more than bringing us into line with what is happening domestically, but having it happen at our borders, I feel. So I don't think there are insurmountable problems there.
Thank you, Gabriel. Jerry, did you want to come in there as well? Jerry Clean.
Sure. Yeah, can you hear me, Eva?
Yep, very good.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything Gabriel said. And I thought one of the most interesting things I observed during the Brexit transition kind of troubles at Dover recently was that at the drop of a hat, people found solutions, and trailers were being sent across without trucks on, across to France. So these are things that we were told in Ireland couldn't happen, that they were all impossible. And we had all the usual excuses, but they are doable. And then, you know, in terms of working practices for lots of folks who commute, you know, to and from the UK in particular, from all the small airports, you know, it kind of reminds me of the days when we used to live here in Ifakara. And basically, I would never leave the house for less than 3 weeks because it wasn't worthwhile, because it took so long.
The line is breaking up there, Jerry.
10 hours to get to the nearest airport.
The line is breaking up there, Jerry.
You change the way you plan your travel. And a lot of employers already do this in many sectors. You know, mines in the middle of nowhere, a lot of work on this. Okay.
Thanks,
well, then maybe Julian should just take over.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Sure, then let's give up on that. Let Julian take over.
Yeah, we'll let him solve all the problems. I think Tomas wanted to come in here as well. Tomas Ryan.
I think with respect to international travel quarantine, it has evidently been shown to work very well in South Korea, in Australia, in New Zealand, and other countries. So there's no question here about whether we can do it. We have the hotel rooms to do it. I think there's been false narratives in the media about the importance of international travel in Ireland relative to Australia and New Zealand. Anybody who has worked or spent time in Australia or New Zealand knows that they are an incredibly open international economies, just like Ireland. They rely on their airports for interconnectedness just as much as Ireland for all the same reasons. So the idea that we can't do this because of our economy is really a false narrative. And I think that when we consider how we're going to manage this going forward, this is an absolutely essential component. And if you look at the economic costings of what happened in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, the Grattan Institute did a very thorough prospective study of whether repeated lockdowns or border restrictions followed by opening up the economy, which approach would be more appropriate. They, like every other organization in the world that has compared these options, found that it was more economically beneficial to suffer the effects of border closure, which are significant. It does interfere with international business travel. It does interfere with international tourism, obviously, neither of which are normal anyway at this point in time. But the benefits from every such study have been shown to be outweigh those costs. And the evidence from Australia and New Zealand since then has been clear. So I think when we're having these discussions in Ireland and in particular in the media, we need to parameterize them to accept the fact that this works in Australia, that this works in New Zealand, and we can make them work for us if we want to.
Thank you, Tomas. There's a couple of related questions are essentially asking, how long will it take if we were to implement quarantine and other strict regulations, how long would that take? Should we be implementing even stricter restrictions? And somebody else also asking, what are the chances of a fourth wave? I think those questions are all linked together. I don't know, Paul, maybe would you feel comfortable giving a bit of an answer there, and maybe Philip as well? I don't know if Andrew might also have a view there.
I suppose Yanir as well be the person that's here to answer most of them. But typically you're talking about 4 to 6 weeks if you do everything properly, irrespective of how transmittable the virus is itself. So you lock as many people as you can inside small bubbles, your households. You protect your hospitals, and then it eventually just get hospital cases and household cases, and you don't have to worry about the random cases that come in from somebody landing and seeding a new case in the middle of nowhere, and the whole thing starts all over again.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the amount of time, the main thing is that it's controlled by the incubation period, how long we have to wait to know that people are sick. And basically, if we do it for 2 incubation periods, which is a month and a little bit more, then we can identify all the cases and isolate them, and we can have rapid declines. And Ireland recently has had a very rapid decline, showing that it's possible. And presumably the information from both UK and Ireland together suggests that we can control the new variant if we take these very strong measures. But without the very strong measures, then there's very little hope to control it. So the main thing is to get it under control quickly, and then to use the fact that we've gained under control to return to normal through a process of opening up areas that are free of the virus.
Thanks, Yanir. Yeah, so I think it is quite positive that I think the 4 to 6 weeks, considering what we've been through for basically a year now, 4 to 6 weeks to get this really under control, if we all really take all of the restrictions seriously and comply as much as possible. I think that sounds quite appealing to me. I'd like to have a much more normality in 6 weeks. So there's a question here, one person asking the panel's thoughts on maybe a need for kind of immediate temporary flight bans pending implementation of the quarantine. Should we be acting with great urgency right now, or should we wait until we establish the quarantine system? Are there any views on that in the panel? Gabriel?
Well, yes, I mean, I would act right away and do what it would do. I mean, Mike Ryan is one of the most famous Irishmen in the world these days, if not the most famous Irishman in the world. And one of his wonderful press conferences at WHO was asked about the lessons from Ebola. And his view was, act now, get ahead of this virus. If you don't get ahead of it, you'll have to play catch up. Go in hard and do it now. Have no regrets, do the stuff. Personally, at the moment, given the emergence of these variants, I think there is no time to lose. And we should act immediately to stop flights. And we should act immediately to put the toughest quarantine arrangements we can in place as soon as we can. And that's the only safe thing to do. But again, I stress it has to be one of a whole package of things that has to happen. And one of the failures, I think, of successive governments in different countries has been that they've been looking for a silver bullet answer. And my fear at the moment is that they regard vaccination as the silver bullet, and that we're going to actually make the situation worse in the shorter term because of that. So I would absolutely act now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's actually negligent to just think that the vaccine can solve everything, because while we wait, we increase the chances that a vaccine-resistant strain arises. Philip, I see you raising your hand there.
Yeah, I can only echo what Gabriel said. So the earlier you act, the better. And just recent history was a good example for that. So Ireland was praised when they acted very quickly in November or October, November. So this was, say, compared to my home country, like 2 weeks earlier, and those 2 weeks had a decisive impact on the numbers, not getting to, say, 5 digits, but staying around like a little bit higher than 1,000. Another thing about time frame is that we have to be aware that we talk about say fractions of the amount being reduced. So in November, October, we had about 2 to 3 weeks where it came down to 1/3 of what it was before. So if you start at, say, 900, just to use a 3-digit figure, then after 2 to 3 weeks, you're down at 300. Another 2 to 3 weeks, you're down at 100. So it's always the same period and the same fraction that will remain.
Yeah. I have one more comment to add, which is there's this tendency to believe that the situation you're in will be the situation you're in. So before we had the pandemic, people didn't believe that they would be different. And now that we're in it, we somehow think that it cannot change. But to realize that it could be much different is a super important part of taking action. And comparing life in countries that have the virus and life in countries that have successfully eliminated it, including Australia and New Zealand, is night and day. It's super different. People have very different ongoing experience of life. And so the point is that if one realizes that that's a choice, that we can make that choice, and it only takes actually a few weeks to get there, then it's really the obvious choice, and we should just do it.
Thank you, Yanir. That's so wonderful the way you put that. I mean, yes, that, I think we might have, many of us have forgotten that there is another way, and we have a choice, and we need to, and the choice, like you say, the reward is so immense for getting this under control, that we can have our lives back again. We can do all the things that people are missing, but we can do it without setting off a little countdown for the next major crisis and lockdown. We can do it safely. And I think it's really important that we remember that. So there's a question here. What's the end game after implementation of mandatory quarantine? Could we pair up with other zero COVID countries and allow free movement again? Or would we need to wait for a vaccine to reopen travel? Is anybody? Gabriel, thank you.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I've watched what's been going on, and I'm afraid in terms of having quarantine-free travel, it doesn't seem to have really worked in very many places. And I think that's probably because the difference in quarantine arrangements, perhaps. But I think in the short term, I don't think that will be possible, but in the longer term, yes. Personally, the way I see out of it, once we have vaccination rolled out and properly evaluated, and everyone's had 2 doses for a start, and there may be a possibility of having a system like the international certificate of immunity and vaccination. I can't remember the precise title of it, which is an internationally recognized document, which if you travel to a country where yellow fever is endemic, you'll be required to have that. And there is no reason why we couldn't have a properly structured system for that. And I know the World Economic Forum has been proposing a system of electronic passports covering COVID-19 vaccination, but we need to be sure that the vaccine will work, and we also need to be sure that it can't be circumvented by any of the variants that are popping up. So it's the pathway for that is a difficult one going forward, I think.
Thank you, Gabriel. Paul?
Well, it's just on that it's going to depend on which vaccines people have. If they're ones that stop transmission, sure, you can let them in. If it's some that don't, then there's that risk depending on what country they come from. But just this idea that a vaccine alone will let us pass may not be sufficient. But we won't know that for a while.
There's a related question, because somebody's asking about these reports in the Times of Israel about the efficacy of the first dose. And I think there were also some reports about whether or not there was a reduction in transmission, not only disease incidence. And the reason these things are coming out of Israel, of course, is that Israel got a lot of vaccine doses very early. And what I heard was that one of the conditions attached to this was that they would release data, so in a sense help inform the whole vaccination process. So yeah, so the 2 aspects there about the efficacy of the first dose and about the reduction in transmission. So is anybody happy? Sam, please.
Yeah, I follow this idea of transmission blocking or not very, very carefully. My view is that the vaccines have quite rightly been studied in very large phase 3 studies that convince us that they're safe and convince us that they prevent mild and moderate disease very, very effectively, much more effective than we really expected, and also seem to prevent severe disease and death. But those phase 3 licensing studies were not designed to show whether they prevented transmission from one person to another, because that's not what you need for a phase 3 licensing study. It's a different question. So they're safe and they prevent, death and severe disease and mild disease, but do they prevent transmission? And unfortunately, at this point, we don't know that yet. And when the vaccines have been given to primates, as they were before to humans, the primates did get what you might call an upper respiratory infection due to COVID-19 after a challenge. So they still had some SARS-2 replication and some lower viral loads in the vaccinated primates than in the non-vaccinated primates, but they still had some shedding. So it looks as if there's some effect on transmission, but how much is that in humans? Frankly, we don't know. The Pfizer are doing studies on this, and I believe they're saying by February they will have some data on this at individual level. Then at population level, maybe in Israel, we'll be able to see the sort of community impact of population level decrease in transmission due to vaccine, but we simply don't know that yet. So it's something you can't rely on at this point. You have to wait until it's shown in both individual level and population level before we build a public policy based on that assumption of transmission blocking.
Thank you, Sam. I think Andrew and then Paul.
Yep, so just to jump in on that, I think at first sight, it can be quite concerning seeing the data from Israel suggesting that the effectiveness is only about 33% or something. But there have been people that have looked into this in a bit more detail, and it very much looks like a lot of those who were infected and then subsequently hospitalized were actually infected either before they got the vaccine or very early on before it actually kicked in. So there's a figure here saying that 375 people were hospitalized after getting the vaccine, but 244 of those were in the first week when the data suggests that the vaccine wouldn't actually be effective yet. And then a number of those were in the second week, whereas after that, very few were actually hospitalized. So it's a bit more reassuring when you look into the detail of it than when you see the headline figure saying 33%. But I think it raises the issue of we need to remind people before they get the vaccine and after that to take precautions and at least wait 2 weeks before you change any kind of behaviors.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see as we learn more about the vaccine rollout from other countries and from our own. There's a question regarding coordination with the UK. And I think, at the moment, it's probably the most opportune because there's discussion in the UK that they are going to introduce hotel quarantine. So we get coordination by stealth in a certain sense if that happens, because that will definitely help us. And and the issues around the border and that how this might not be a perfect quarantine solution there. Does anybody want to talk about that? Gabriel?
I certainly do. I think it's a key issue that we have to address full front. And I must say, I have been extraordinarily disappointed in some of the politicians who, when they have been pressed on this issue about taking an all-Ireland approach and doing things like putting in quarantine and a unified approach to contact testing, they said, oh no, it'll never happen, or the DUP won't agree, or it's impossible is a good word, isn't it? They say it's impossible. Never say why it is impossible. They are the people who make it possible or impossible. And I say to those politicians, very senior politicians, for whom I have had great respect, that I'm so glad that they weren't around at the time of the peace process. Because if anyone had said that you'd have got Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness sitting down together in the Assembly as First Minister and Deputy First Minister, you'd have been sectioned under the Mental Health Acts. And it happened because there were politicians who had vision, had a determination, and saw that it was possible to bring the Troubles to the end, and they did it. And it is possible to bring this pandemic to an end in this island, but it requires the politicians of similar caliber and drive and intelligence to take it forward. And I appeal to the politicians, North and South, if they can lay aside some of their prejudices and party political interests, and please do this, get this North-South cooperation, because the so-called agreement, the memorandum of understanding, has been a tissue paper. It hasn't delivered anything. And now is a great time for those politicians to deliver for all of the people of the island.
Thank you, Gabriel. I couldn't agree more. And I see there are very positive responses coming from attendees here as well, saying hear, hear. And I think, definitely this is a difficult problem, but there's no excuse for not trying. If the politicians were trying and it didn't work, then they could see what wasn't working, but not trying at all. I'm afraid it wears quite thin with me. Nessa.
Yeah, just wanted to echo everything that Gabriel said, and being somebody who works in the area of Irish studies, you know, we have to learn the lessons of the past. We have to learn that we have to be more ambitious than what we are doing now. We wouldn't have had the Good Friday Agreement only for a particular kind of vision and statesmanship, actually. And I'm thinking of the words of another educator who said, you know, we're not here to be right, but we're here to get it right. So I think we need to move beyond party politics. We need to move beyond territorial restrictions and thinking about things in a particular way with a typical kind of mentality that is only serving to get us back into another rolling lockdown, opening up back into another rolling lockdown. We need to change that. There has to be a paradigm shift. There has to be a new way and a new approach of doing it. We've done it really well. The majority of the people, as we've seen this morning from the opinion polls, the majority of the citizens of Ireland understand what we need to do. The politicians now need to listen, because people will remember it in the ballot box afterwards. The second thing I just want to say is we need to get real that this year is the year of the domestic economy. There's not going to be any international travel. There's not going to be any international rugby matches. There's not going to be international concerts in the O2. And people are not going to be traveling and moving around internationally as they would like. The Vax and Go idea is just not going to be operational for 2021. So we just need to just get real with that now and say we actually have an opportunity now to reboot our economy, to get our society back up and running, to get our children back into school. I was listening to a mother on Clare Byrne this morning. Her child, who has special and additional needs, is banging his head off a car, and she almost drove the car off the road. Like, this is just unacceptable. And the politics of negativity and the politics of saying, of impossibility is not acceptable anymore. It's not acceptable for our children, it's not acceptable for our elders, and it's not acceptable in 2021 to say we can't do it. Of course we can do it, but we just need to decide to make that decision now. And for those children today that are not in school, for those mothers who are trying, and those fathers and caregivers around the country who are trying hand and heart to do their very, very best to keep everything going, they don't have a fourth lockdown in them. And that's all I'll say. So we need to be better. And in the darkest time, we need people to shine brighter, and we need our politicians to listen to the 90% of the citizens of Ireland to say we need to fix this now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nessa. That is wonderful, and we needed to hear that, and we needed that to be said. We're going to wrap up very soon. I just want to bounce back to Jerry, just if he has a couple of comments about the vaccine, and then we'll have a little wrap up and we'll let you all go on about your day.
How's the bandwidth?
So far, so good.
I'll give it a try. Just to emphasize that the results we've had from vaccine trials thus far are measurements of efficacy, not effectiveness. So efficacy is how things work under controlled conditions of a carefully managed trial. It's not the same thing as effectiveness in the real world. And the only way to measure long-term effectiveness is over the long term, you know, after vaccines have been wide-scale use. We don't know what their properties are now. So this is why vaccines and a zero COVID approach are not competing approaches, they're complementary. We need a zero COVID approach to hold the fort until we're sure that the vaccines can really deliver on protecting us. Because some of the news coming out of places like Manaus makes COVID look like something I'm very familiar with, and that could put us into a pretty nasty endemic situation. So, you know, let's lock in that situation until we're sure. And everything Nessa said is correct.
Thanks, Jerry. Ivan, did you want to come in there, or did I? Yep, you're still muted. Yeah.
Just a very brief comment on the vaccines. As we are a global centre for the pharma sector, we need to keep the pressure on to ensure that vaccines are made available to lower and middle income countries, whether it be through generic licensing agreement and so on. But just the message has to be consistent that no one is vaccinated until we are all vaccinated globally.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Yes, that's a very good point. Within the country, nobody's safe till everybody is safe, and globally, that's equally true, and we need to remember that. So thank you very much to all of the panelists today. Thank you to the attendees for coming. We have a few people asking, how can they help? How can they contribute? How can they, help push forward this this strategy? And I think, we'd like you to, we're very grateful for your support. We'd like to find ways to channel that support. If in the short term, talk to your TDs or send messages there, but we'd like to help people get organized and to really campaign for this. We've done this as a country before. We've brought change from the people up, and maybe we can do that again this time. But thank you very much to everybody for listening. I hope you found that useful. Just the basic message that quarantine is going to be a very important part of a strategy to get this under control and keep it under control. We have choices to make. We have a decision. We can choose how to spend 2021. We can spend 2021 in a much more open way. We can start living again. We can do all of the things we enjoy. There's an enormous reward there. And with just the small sacrifice of international travel while we wait for the vaccines to do their wonderful work, and we at the same time are stacking all the odds in favor of the vaccine working effectively. So thank you very much to everybody for talking today. Thank you very much to the attendees for listening. I hope you found that useful, and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.